We're on the fringe with our good friend Stuart Bolus, and we're talking about West Africa. And I guess we're talking about the future of West Africa a little bit. Sort of the place of West Africa as a test bed for what?
Well, could be AI videos of Eminem praising Ibrahim Traore and R. Kelly as well. Believe it or not, R. Kelly might have a new song praising Ibrahim Traore. Who knows? Maybe Maroon 5 will too at some point.
I don't think they're that popular, but okay. Uh, Anyways, we were just sort of talking about, and I think that was a really good point to go back to. We're just talking about the difficulties in the region as a whole, sort of I would say, lack of Western, not perspective, but I think understanding of the importance of this region. Would that be correct, Stuart?
Yeah, I think as a whole, the Western world has looked upon West Africa with a certain view, usually one of you know, paternalistic, patronizing kind of tone, and some of these countries have turned away from the West and have turned to Russia, has led them to just be very blasé and in some cases even gleeful that these countries are really struggling, uh, not realizing that, especially for the Europeans, these countries are not that far away from them. And, if you're a country, it's not great if 1,000 miles away someone falls to an Islamic insurgency. That does cause problems for you quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, and these are countries that are connected economically. These are connected in terms of having large migrant populations. I mean,
Mm,
these are not sort of these abstract zones on a map.
mm,
These are places with quite visceral links in some cases to particularly Europe. And I
yeah,
think, yeah, when you do have, and I hate to say it, but I do think the French are probably more guilty of this than anyone else. When you do have people going, aha, we told you you wouldn't last 3 years without us, it doesn't help the overall situation, really, particularly when it's going to explode in your backyard.
yeah, definitely. And the fact of the matter is, the French in the Sahelian countries helping them fight jihadist insurgency were very similar to the Americans in Afghanistan in that they could keep a pretty kind of unstable status quo going, but they couldn't actually defeat this. And I think, American in Afghanistan as well and in Vietnam shows, if you're a Western power, there's only so long you can stay in another country, continue to bleed resources and men before people in your own country start saying, what are we even doing here? And people in the host country say, you've been here for a decade, there's no results. Do you want to stay here another 10, 20 years? I mean, is that what you want to do? So, for them to be gleeful and saying we did a better job, it's like, but you had 10 years and you didn't beat this thing. So it's not that strange that the country's decided to choose a new partner. And also, the French military in particular tended
Hmm.
to treat the host country's militaries with a real degree of disdain. I remember reading a report from Mali that, the French bases in the country, when they would fly in equipment, they wouldn't tell the Malian airport authorities what was coming in. So they were just saying, oh, plane is coming and going. They don't speak to us when we ask them to designate who they are. So they say they feel we don't really know what's going on in our own country, and that causes resentment in the militaries, which is not surprising that over time they want these people to leave.
And it is worth noting that with all the countries you just talked about, Mali, Burkina, Niger, these are all former French colonies. So
Yeah.
there was already the sort of latent, and I could definitely speak to this in Niger. There was a very latent sort of simmering resentment towards the French. And that was I think people forget, but that was a huge sore spot until they got kicked out that you did have sizable French military presence in all three of those countries, and they were
Yeah.
not accountable to local authorities.
No.
Um, there was no, okay, we'll ask your permission to do this. They took orders from Paris. They carried out their orders. And if local authorities had an issue with that, I think at best they were sort of treated with bemused contempt.
Yeah.
Um, it was not a sustainable situation, I'll say that.
Not sustainable, and there is an issue. Let's say you're military and you want to go to your civilian leaders at the time and
Mm,
and say, "Oh yeah, we're not happy with this relationship as is." You know, you're just not going to get a response from your president, which is going to satisfy you. They're probably just going to either not reply, or even if they go to Paris, they just look like a subordinate when they turn up. And it's like, this isn't a leader who's standing up for us. It's a leader who's gone to receive orders from the metropole, or like from Paris, and come back, and now he's telling us what Paris wants. Which is why resentment against their own democratic leaders really started brewing. But to kind of broaden the conversation, I have a theory, which is simply that France, in particular, with its ex colonies, really didn't install any kind of I wasn't stable, but a strong kind of democratic tradition in, frankly, any of its ex colonies. And, when you look at on the African context, I think, Gavin, you and I spoke about this, but the only
mm.
countries on the African continent who used to be French, who I say currently have like a healthy democracy, is probably Senegal and maybe Benin, and that's it. That's
And,
a
and
really poor
yeah,
legacy to leave.
Mhm.
and it's worth noting that there are a ton of francophone countries in Africa. It's got to be well over 20, I would expect. So when we say two are like quasi-functioning democracies, and I would agree with you on Senegal. I'd say Benin, maybe sometimes on a good day. It's not a great legacy. Uh, Stuart, how does that play out in West Africa?
Well, problem is, so this conversation is so broad, trying to distill it in a way which works for a podcast setting, is that ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States, a regional grouping, um, the Sahelian countries of Burkina, Niger, and Mali broke away, um, at the beginning of this year,
Mhm.
um, officially, even though, a year beforehand, they basically said they were going to leave. Um, so you now have a grouping which says it supports democracies. However, the majority of its members, it's charitable to say that they are democracies. You have elections which, frankly, just look like complete shams. The results are usually so in favor of one candidate. So I think the recent election in Cote d'Ivoire, the president won 89% of the votes.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is done by something called lawfare, which is, you allow an election to happen, but any serious opponent who pops up, you just shower them with, oh, you didn't file your party nomination forms correctly, so you delay them, you disqualify them. So when the election comes, it's you, the incumbent president, who's on all the airwaves, everyone knows who you are, and a bunch of no names no one knows. So even if you really dislike the government, you're probably unwilling to vote for an opposition person you just don't know about. So it means that you probably are not going to go vote. So the only people who turn up are the president's own people, and then they just win a ridiculous amount of the votes. And that's happening in a lot of countries, not just in West Africa, all over Africa. I mean, I even have a list here of countries in the last 5 years and their in Africa and some of the results they've got. So, for example,
Mm.
Rwanda in 2024, 99% of the vote to Paul Kagame.
Oh,
Uh, Tanzania, which was last month, 97% of the vote for the president. Uh, Djibouti, this was in 2021, 97% of the vote. Equatorial Guinea, 2022, 95% of the vote. Gabon, 95% of the vote. Algeria,
Oh,
95% of the vote. Tunisia, 90%. Yeah, Ivory Coast, I just mentioned, 89%. Egypt, 90%. So, the picture is there. These are elections. It's quite difficult to find credible because even the experiment I use in my head is, the classic question, which you get in Hinge and stuff like that is, do you like pineapple on pizza? Yes or no, right? If you get 100 people, you're not going to get 90% saying one way or the other, right? It's going to be a mix, okay? Like maybe 60%, 70% if you're really pushing it.
Well,
But
Stuart, you're picking the wrong people. That's the
Yeah,
issue.
it's a sample. Stuart, that's a sampling problem right there.
Well, yeah, and unfortunately, I think there were a lot of leaders in Africa who would agree with that and go, this is the issue. It's a sampling problem. We need
yeah,
to. It reminds me of that old, I think it was originally about the USSR, though it applies to a lot of countries,
yeah,
where there's like a fake referendum and the vote doesn't go the way the bosses want. And the pollster says, I'm sorry, we got the wrong result. And the guy says, no, you're an idiot. We got the wrong voters.
yeah.
Mhm.
And, it is funny you mentioned that. And I agree it's somewhat humorous. But it is a situation where, for many African youth, remember the majority of Africa is youth currently,
Yeah.
they look at their democratic systems and they say, oh, this party or president has been in charge for decades. The situation in the country isn't great. I'm supposed to, with this system, be able to have a choice to pick someone else, but these choices don't seem to really exist. And I'm getting quite despondent. I don't know how to change anything. And so that's why you're starting seeing in the last 5 years, really, the amount of successful coups has been
Mm,
much higher now than in the last, 20 years combined, really, because people are just saying, yeah, why wouldn't I support a military leader? Because at least it's a change of some sort, which I'm not
yeah.
getting by the ballot
Mm.
box. And sometimes, if you've seen like Burkina, that's the only way you actually get a leader who is actually kind of young. Even if it's people in their 40s and 50s, it's better than having, as we had in Cameroon, a man who's in his 90s, still running and quote unquote winning an election.
Winning an election and flying directly to Switzerland. What's the Paul
Yeah,
Biya
because he,
way?
yeah,
Yep.
because he doesn't. Yes, that yeah, Paul Biya of Cameroon. He basically only did one campaign rally the entire election, and many rallies that were held by his party, people were. He actually had like marionettes, big like puppets made of him at rallies to kind of show him off. He wasn't there. Like they just create. Yeah, it's just like a circus, and then he has people, showing him his effigies essentially because he doesn't campaign. He's 92, right? Obviously, um, but that this calling this a democracy is it's beyond a joke at this point, and many Africans have caught on to this. But the institutions, ECOWAS being one, but the African Union being another, they will still just congratulate a leader because they have this sort of convention of, we don't like military coups and corrupt presidents like this because they don't like their military are referring them. So they'll always condemn a coup, no matter what the situations were around for this coup to happen. So even if I don't know, the government ended up slaughtering a bunch of people in the process after the election, and then the coup happens, they'll still condemn it. The coup, that is, not what happened beforehand. And it doesn't matter how shambolic your election is, the African Union will always give it a stamp of approval, no questions asked. They might say, well, it could have been a bit better, but having the
That's
African
about
Union,
it.
yeah,
Mm.
stamp of approval is so easy to get, it doesn't mean anything. And to many people on the continent are saying, what is the point of this institution which somehow is blind to the problems of African citizens and only seems to care about what African presidents want? And it's just creating a big crisis of confidence in democracy itself. Because I was even thinking, I'm sorry I'm rambling a bit, but
No,
I
no.
actually think, because actually I'd like to bring you two in, Dave, in this, because I'm going to say something about the two-party system, and as an American, I'm sure you're going to have strong views about this. I think the two-party system in Africa is actually a very good thing because I use Ghana as an example, which does have a two-party system. It means that no matter who's in charge, the opposition is still a kind of well-funded, has a good groundswell of support across the country, but is always able to challenge who's in power. And I know, like in America and other countries, it creates a problem that you've got two parties, they're very similar, etc., etc., but they can beat each other. Because what you end up in many African countries is a one-party state where there are many opposition parties, all of them are pointless, they can't get elected, and having a multi-party system in many African countries it just doesn't work because none of these parties can ever gain enough traction to beat who's in charge. Well, in Ghana, for example, we had our election in the end of 2024. The incumbent party, been there for 8 years, they lost in a landslide. But, their MPs are still in parliament making lots of noise, who, the government who are now the opposition. But you look at all these elections I mentioned earlier, none of these have like credible opposition parties who are allowed to contest. I mean, Tanzania does have a good opposition party, but they just got banned, right?
And
And
that was after the entire leadership was thrown into jail. I mean, so
exactly,
I think I'll contest that slightly. I'll give David a chance to talk, but just I have a slight disagreement with you there, Stuart, because I think the issue is multi-party democracy in Africa in a lot of countries. I'm not going to say every country because that's not true. In a lot of countries was never allowed to develop into a competitive system.
that's very true.
So because it's not a fair playing field. It's window dressing in
Yeah,
most of these countries
Mhm.
that we're talking about. They were never allowed to be competitive. If they were, like the Tanzania example, you're shut down almost immediately. So I don't know if it's necessarily. I'll take the point in that I think when you look at countries like Ghana or even Senegal, where you have two, maybe three larger parties that can put up some oppositional voice, can sort of hold the ruling party accountable. I agree that I think that's a good thing in that context, but I think a multi-party system would work if it was
if
allowed to.
I think there's one example where I feel it does, and that's in South Africa, where there are,
Mm.
because South Africa now is a coalition government, right, which is the epitome of multi-party democracy, of parties having to work together to run a country. And they've got the ANC, they've got the Democratic Congress,
They've got the Freedom Front.
Democratic Alliance, sorry, Incaf, Economic Freedom Fighters, Inkatha Freedom Party. Also, they've got like some far right board parties, but they are actually that is a proper multi-party democracy on the African continent, which I do admire in many ways. What did it take for them to get there? Decades of brutal oppression. So you don't necessarily want every country to have to go through the pressure cooker of apartheid
Yeah.
to come out with that.
No.
But yeah, Dave, I'm interested to hear your take because you obviously live in a very baked-in two-party system. And do you see the benefits of it, or in the African context, or would you prefer to see something else?
So this is going to be kind of a long-winded rant here, but let's go back to South Africa real quick. And I
Hmm.
think you had South Africa come together because it did have strong institutions that were laid primarily by the British, and Nelson Mandela was able to take advantage of those and unite the whole entire country, largely. Can't
Mm,
say the whole entire country, but largely. And these other countries, I think, don't have the institutions and don't have the judicial systems in place to actually have free and fair elections. To
mm,
have free elections, you've got to have a clean judicial system. And I
mm,
think if these countries, I mean, like you were saying earlier, Tanzania, they have 97% of the people, voting for the president. Official turnout is like 87, 88%, but there's nobody at the polls. So if there's going to
mm,
be nobody that's willing to go and investigate and say there's something that doesn't really add up here with
mm,
this, it doesn't matter. You're never going to have a free and fair election. You've got to have people that are willing to step up and go, look, this is not right. And these rules that we have in place are not being followed. And I think that's the first thing that has to happen in these countries is they've got to build stronger judicial institutions to actually make free and fair elections a possibility.
definitely. I'll say to link that a good example of that. in the last couple of years was Malawi, where they had an election recently, but the election beforehand, um, the incumbent president then, he won an election, it was contested, and then their Supreme Court said, yeah, there's too many problems with this election. It actually has to be redone. And then he lost. Um, and that was really shocking on the African continent. But, yes, the justice system did stand up to the president and said there's too many irregularities here for us to actually certify this. But the interesting thing there is you'd think, that president would be disgraced and the new president would be a champion. Actually, the election which happened, the next election which happened like a month ago, that previous president came back and the president who was there is kicked out because the economy collapsed under his watch. So, in Africa, anything can happen. But yeah,
And
I do.
also, yeah, sorry to
No,
jump
no,
in
go
there.
ahead. Go ahead.
I also think there's something to be said for in countries like Malawi and definitely in Niger as well before the military took over. In the more sort of what I would describe as mid-sized countries in sub-Saharan Africa, you you do sort of have a revolving door when it comes to political elites. I
Mm,
mean, what you just described in Malawi, and that as sort of maybe anticlimactic as that probably was for a lot of people, there's something great about that because it's like, well, he got voted out democratically and then he came back in. And as far as I can
democratically.
tell, he
Yeah.
came back democratically. Yeah, people wanted him back. So that's a positive, but it also happens non-democratically in a
Yeah.
lot of countries. I was just thinking about I forgot the fella's name, but you might remember that guy in Mozambique who claimed he'd won the election.
Oh, yes. The name escapes me now. But yes, I know the one you mean. And he,
And
he he had a lot of protests. Yeah.
he had massive protests and there was a big kerfluffle and it was, it's just basically the same thing as Tanzania. The ruling party had clearly rigged it. The turnout was off. It took them like a month to count the ballots. It
Mm,
was just very obviously not a free and fair election. The opposition leader, came out very strongly. There was protests in the streets, very bloody protests in the end. And, the hilarious, well, not hilarious, the really sad thing about all of that is what ended up happening. They asked him to come back and offered him a position in government, and he dropped all the protests.
yeah.
And
And yeah.
he is, wait, no. Does he have a position in cabinet? He was offered something. I know that.
Uh, Mozambique's a country I'm not as familiar with as I should be, so I can't clarify that. But I know in Cameroon,
Venancio Mondlane. That's the
yes,
fella.
and that happens where sometimes if the elites are challenged, they then just throw a bone. That happened in
Yeah.
Cameroon recently, but the guy, yeah, where the opposition leader was offered the post
No.
of prime minister, but he said no, I don't want it. So it doesn't always work. But to throw something to you both is something that I've noticed. I think I said this to you, Gavin, before in our previous personal conversations. But so Dave, I'll definitely take your point for a strong judiciary which is able to act independently is a crucial foundation. If you don't have that, your democracy is most likely not going to succeed. But also, there's two particular factors which I've noticed that if you don't have these two things, it's very unlikely your democracy is going to be free or fair. One is there independent pollsters who are able to just like poll the country during a term? Because when you notice many African countries, there is no real polling agency. Because if you're not a democracy, you're not going to allow real polling during your term because then the polling will kind of clearly show that you shouldn't be winning an election. And if you have that all during the year, then suddenly election comes and you're winning 50% more than the polling says, people will have more questions about your legitimacy. So Ghana has some very good independent pollsters. So even before the election, it was very clear where the election was going, and they were within the margin of error of what they predicted. Right. So that's the first. So I'd like to discuss that. And the second thing is when an election happens, is each constituency, I know in America use a different term for that, district, right? Is every district constituency allowed to announce the results independently on during an election night, or the days, rather than what tends to happen a lot is the election happens and you sit around for 2 weeks waiting to
Yeah.
actually know what and then they just announce it midnight. Oh, by the way, this was the result. Because in Ghana, I know I keep using Ghana as an example, but I see it as a model democracy in terms of how they conduct elections. Each constituency releases its results independently within the day or so. So you can kind of see the trend as the results are trickling in. Then
Mm.
it's harder to rig that, because then you say, hang on, how is it all these constituencies vote this way, but here it's completely out of whack in this particular, in these two polling areas. And that's where you can easily spot the irregularities. So in my view, having those two things really strengthens your democracy. And I think there should be more focus on that, rather than saying you need to have some European Union election observers who are not going to really show anything or change anything, to
Or
be honest.
or African Union election observers who
Or
are
any observers of any sort, because all they do is write a report afterwards.
and spend a lot of money at the hotel restaurant usually.
Yeah. But what
Um,
do you two think about that? Those two propositions.
I mean, I think in Texas, everything is done locally, from my understanding. And I think in most
Mm,
states too, I think almost everything is done locally. And I mean, if you watch the news here, if you watch, CNN or Fox or any of the major news channels too, they'll be talking throughout the night. We've got election results coming in, we've got results coming in.
exactly.
yeah.
So I think they're counting these, and they're in contact with people in the local districts or in the counties or wherever they're counting the results, and they're feeding that information. So if
Yes.
there is something that's irregular, then they're going to go, okay, that's weird. We need to go back and actually check this and make sure everything's correct before we pass it on. So there are
Exactly.
layers of accountability within the system that are baked in there. Versus it sounds like over there, there's virtually nothing. Where, yeah, we're going to take our time and, we'll count these. No, look, we found, 2,000 or 3,000 or 2 million ballots, and we're just going to throw these in there. We forgot to count them.
Mm,
And oh, instead of 96%, it's 97%.
Yeah.
yes.
I mean,
Because
and that's
Cameroon,
like that's Cameroon.
it
In a
took them
day.
it took them 2.5 weeks. If it just makes any
Yeah.
sense, like, why did it take so long? And no, so basically, you're a citizen, you vote, and yes, you sit around for 2 weeks waiting to hear what the result was. You don't know, how your area even voted until the end of those 2 weeks. So rather than having the electoral commission like in Ghana, I know I keep using Ghana, but which basically all they do is they certify the result, but the results are basically published, and they have observers who is in each place who just goes, yeah, that's the result. We can certify it. So no party can contest this after this, rather than literally no one knows what the hell is happening. And then, I remember Gabon, literally, when they released their results,
Oh my
and then the
God.
coup
Yeah.
happened, an hour later, they released the results at like 2 a.m. And they wanted to do that because they were like, oh, there'll be less chance of a protest if people are asleep when the results come out. But it doesn't make any sense.
Well, I mean, it does if you view them as a formality, which I
Yes.
think in countries like Gabon and Cameroon, 100%, these are not things that people take seriously. I think in Cameroon, that regime is having to take things seriously because they're fighting two major insurgencies that they're not winning, and they have a president who be as what, 91, 92. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not good. Because, and we've been talking about this, because that regime is so creaky, people are paying attention. People did pay attention to that election, but the conclusion was such a foregone conclusion. I mean, you just knew going into it what you were going to get. To be fair, someone had the foresight not to give him over 60%. I think
Yes.
Bia won a respectable 54, which you can kind of look at and go, well, maybe. I mean, I doubt it, but maybe. Whereas
Yes.
Tanzania, 97%, 80% turnout, which is unheard of. I
Yeah.
don't think so. I
This,
just
this, this, this
that's
is the thing.
divorced from reality.
And then when you have sometimes, like in Cameroon, the opposition leader basically said, oh, there should be a nationwide strike. And then you go to some major towns and like no one's walking in the streets. it gets you to think, okay, if all these people are listening to this opposition leader, maybe these results don't make any sense. But I think one other issue about African democracy, which I'd like to discuss, is even in countries where the democratic systems are stronger, it's the cost of participating. Like in
Yeah.
some countries, oh, you want to register your political party? Oh, yeah, it's $1 million. Like, so if you are a group of people who want to start a political party, where are you crowdfunding $1 million in a country where annual GDP is like $2,500 a year? It's they this create a system where it's like, well, you basically need to be an elite to even take part. So the average citizen who's just like middle class, yeah, you're going to really struggle to be part of this. I know in Ghana this is a particular problem where they have a system where they say, because they don't like regionally based parties, they basically say if you contest, you have to contest everywhere. So it means you have to field candidates all across the country, pay the forms in each constituency. So let's say us three want to start a party. And we're like, you know what? We're from this particular region of Ghana. So realistically, in a more open system, you'll say, we're just going to run 10 candidates in this particular part of the country where we feel will do well. And then if we win some of those, we can then expand because we'll get a bit more money coming in. No, from the outset, you have to contest everywhere, basically bankrupting yourselves in the process. So that's how they keep out other parties because basically no one else can really do this seriously.
So I just pulled this up because you made me think of it. But so recently in Guinea, which also had a coup a couple years ago,
Yes.
uh, in Guinea they just introduced $100,000 political party registration fee. So
See,
they're going to have an election, and you have to smack down $100,000 US dollars
just to
to
contest.
register, just to register.
Yeah.
That's not fielding the candidates. That's not paying for the campaign. That's just the registration fee.
Yeah.
Um, I don't have the I don't have the GDP per capita in Guinea off the top of my head. My guess is there are not a lot of people who are going to be able to do that. That is
No.
a ridiculous, ridiculous fee. And I
Yes.
think, and again, I think it's worth mentioning this because when you talk about democracy, it varies so much. Even when you're having quote unquote free and fair elections, it varies so much from place to place. When we were talking about the results coming in from county to county, I mean, in America, I think most people take that for granted. You
Yeah.
watch the
And UK
TV
as
and the
well.
results come in. In a lot of the world, that's just not how it works. And you have a
Yeah.
centralized bureau. It's a completely non-transparent process. It doesn't make any sense sometimes. And then what you're talking about, I think people might be shocked by the idea of these registration fees, but they're a real reality in a
Yeah,
lot of
because
the world that
in
these
the
things are in
UK,
place.
if you want to contest as an MP, your party will
Mhm.
basically cover a lot of the expenses for you. And you maybe need to contribute a couple £1,000 to like print some extra leaflets and stuff like that. But like, you know, the average person could, if they got their friends to help them, could campaign because the party will give you some help. But in many African democracies, the party is basically on a shoestring budget. If you're not the ruling party, that is,
Mhm.
and it's like, yeah, you basically completely on your own. You're not getting any help, and they're just every election cycle, the cost of registering goes up. So you see in Guinea it's 100K, it'll be 150K next election. And you see that, and you say, well, if that money was paid to electoral commission, these electoral commissions in Africa should be really well funded, but they're not. You see them, they don't have computers, they don't have this, and you say, but hang on, all these parties, you say there's 10 parties contesting. Let's say they all had to register $100,000. Then for the presidential candidates, they probably have to do an extra 100,000. So it's like you should have millions in your budget, but it's not there. So this money just gets siphoned off some way.
Yeah.
So that I think that's something I find really frustrating because you're like, yeah, with these figures, the electoral commission should be really well funded, but they're just not. And I just feel like for many, as I said, for many youth, they just look at the electoral system and they just say, I don't see how I can take part in this. I'm not an elite. And also if you follow many African elections, I say many, but you follow some in some countries, there are no real policies in the campaign. It's simply, the opposition party a lot of the times will go, oh, the government's corrupt, they're wasting your money, vote for me, I won't do that. And the ruling party just say, if you vote for me, I'll finally build that school you've been asking me to do for the last 20 years. And that's the quality of your political discussion. I mean,
I'm gonna
it's
I'm gonna put my tinfoil hat on real quick, Stuart.
mm,
And I really think it's fear. And I think these electoral commissions don't give waivers because they are afraid that they don't have any real power, but
yes.
they have control of the system that's in place. And they know that the system that's in place is very weak and they know it could be toppled over if you had a decent candidate that came up. And I would say there's going to be nobody from any of these countries that's listening, but I would say grant a waiver to a candidate and actually put your money where your mouth is. If you think you are capable of being the president of a country, then grant a waiver and say, okay, come and take me on. And let someone from potentially Gen Z or someone who is not well connected see what they're able to do. Because if this person is able to come from nowhere and they're able to challenge you, that shows that you have a healthy country. You have a healthy electoral system at a grassroots level. It's a litmus test for your country. It's a win-win either way. Because if you don't,
Mhm.
you say, okay, we have this rotten system in place. And if we do want to develop this country, if we want this country to turn into a country that's going to be more developed or live up to its promise, then you've got a lot of work to do. And if you have this challenger come in and they give you a run for your money, then it's happening in front of your eyes.
I think one of the difficulties is in many African countries, there is no real retirement plan for leaders. It's simply, I have so many enemies, I can't retire. It's one problem.
Hmm.
Uh, I mean, a country which did have what you've just described was Gambia in 2017, where the leader, Yahya Jammeh, who had been in power at that point for about 25 years or so, he was a military coup and, leader, and then he became a quote unquote Democrat. But he was very erratic, very dictatorial, and essentially he had his main opposition leader imprisoned. So the opposition picked a compromise candidate who he saw as like a no-hoper. So he was just like, you know what? Yeah, he didn't even try to rig the election. And he lost, which shocked him, essentially. And Gambia had a very interesting electoral system, except had the things we've described. The way you vote in the Gambia is, I don't know if you've seen this, but you vote using marbles. So there's no, you don't have to write, you don't have to read. Basically, when you go into the election booth, there'll just be buckets with the picture of the opposition part of the party you want to vote for, and you just take your marble and you place it in the bucket, right, in front of everyone. Well, not in front of everyone, but basically, people can see where you put it. And then when it's done, they take the bucket and they put it over a tray, and the tray can hold 100 marbles each. And so they go, okay, 100 for this person, throw it away, get the other marble. So they actually could count very quickly, and it was very open and transparent. But yeah, there the leader, he didn't have the election open because he saw it as, I want to have a run for money. It was just arrogance, pure and simple. He didn't think he could lose, and then that created the whole crisis whereby eventually he was forced out of the country by neighboring countries. I think many leaders saw that and said, "You see, this is why I don't have proper elections, because I can't. It's not guaranteed you'll win them if you are a dictator and you have a real election."
Oh, man. Well, that's just been kind of a whistle stop electoral tour of Africa right there. Uh, Slightly discombobulated just thinking about it. But I do remember those marble buckets from Gambia. Um,
Yes,
which,
I've
which
never heard.
also which also makes so much sense when you think about something that doesn't get talked about very much, but that part of the world, particularly West Africa, literacy rates are quite low. So
Yeah.
actually, it would be discriminatory if you made people write out a ballot, because that would assume that everyone who wants to vote can read and write, which is not always the case. Actually, one last anecdote, and I think we'll
Mm.
wrap up for today. But in Niger, I probably told this before, in Niger, before the last coup, when I was living there, I was lucky enough to get a guided tour of the Legislative Assembly. And I believe not the current, the previous Speaker of the House sort of gave us a guided tour. It was kind of wild. And while he was doing that, he was talking about the behavior of the parliamentarians, of the legislators. And he said, it all went to hell when we introduced live recording because everyone would just record the sessions and play it back later and kind of zone out while they were there. So the only people who I didn't have to worry about paying attention during legislative sessions were the illiterate members of the legislature. And I just sort of went, wait, what? And he was like, oh, no, in the Constitution, 25% of the legislatures have to be functionally illiterate. And it was a requirement in the Constitution at that time, because I think it was 45 to 50% of the population couldn't read or write in an acknowledged language. So that would have
Mm.
been basically French or Hausa or maybe Arabic, depending on who you talk to. But if you couldn't read or write in one of those languages, you were considered to be functionally illiterate. And there were
Mm.
quotas. It was, I mean, it was interestingly, it was a very inclusive system because when you talk about it and you go, well, 40% of the population can't read or write, that makes sense. But yeah, he got very nostalgic. He said they were the best MPs because they actually paid attention. And he said,
Yes, because they're not going to read it back later.
they're not going to read it back later. He said they no, they were very rapt when people were speaking. They really paid attention. I still think about that because there are provisions and accommodations for that more than people would think. But again, I don't think when people talk about an election or even the legislative process, that doesn't always get factored in.
I'll definitely agree. And just to make one final point before you wrap up, what you've just said there about having a provision so that uh, illiterate members of society can participate, because this is the thing: being literate doesn't make you smart. It just means you can read text. Doesn't
Yeah.
give you intelligence in that way. It just makes it just gives you another form to access intelligence, but doesn't you don't get your intelligence solely from that. And what I
Hmm.
just described in Gambia with the buckets with marbles just shows to actually have a democratic system, you don't need really expensive voting machines and all this stuff. Like in many African countries, I think they focus on that stuff to say that's what a democracy is. No, it can be actually quite cheap and quite simple to make an electoral system open and competitive. And but I feel they see that, and some of the elite see that and be like, no, but in America they vote like this, so I want that, and they blow money on some stupid IT system which doesn't even work on election day, right? And it just shows you don't need these things for your election to actually work. And if they thought more like that and more, I have to use a word, it might sound a bit patronizing, more humble to like, how can we just make a system where people's votes actually matter? You don't
Hmm.
need to spend billions of dollars to get that system. You can actually spend very little.
Yeah, and going off of what you're saying, Stuart, I mean, if you're counting the votes, that costs nothing if you do it fairly. And
Yes.
that's integral to the whole entire system is it has to be fair and it has to be free. And you've got to establish the rules. If you win, you win. If you lose, you lose. That's the key to everything in a free election. You call a spade, and that makes the election accurate. And like,
Yes. One final point I was going to make this earlier. Very sorry. It's simply this as well. having strong parties kind of also, it doesn't work in the Tanzanian context, I'll say, but means that individuals, leaders, sometimes cannot become the dictators and stay in power they want to. Because to use a quick Ghanaian example, we've got 2 terms in the constitution. They can be non-consecutive, but once you've done those, you can't run again. And the good thing about the party system in Ghana is, even if you were a very popular president and you wanted to run for a 3rd term, your own party would stop you doing it, purely because there'll be elites in your party who will say, "Nah, it's my turn now." And I think that in those contexts, make sure you don't end up as someone who's there for like 30 years, which we see all across the continent. Because if you make sure the parties are strong, they actually act as a check on individual greed in power. And if that could be instituted in more African systems, I think it could be really helpful.
Well, thank you for your contribution, Stuart, and it's been a great conversation today. And I'm sure we'll have you on again at some point in the future. To
Sure.
our community, thank you for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, share, do what you do. And yeah, just great to have you on, Stuart, and talk to you real soon. From me
Thank
and
you very
Dave,
much.
this is On the Fringe.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.